Chapter 46. Talk to the Hand. Aemond. Whatever else she may be, his betrothed was a persistent one, leaving Aemond with no choice but to run as fast as he could. The speed and jostling had knocked his hood off, and his legs were starting to feel the strain. He dashed down the street while the quick puffs of smoke on the air revealed how rapid his breathing had become trying to stay ahead of an angry witch. "You twat!" Ariel's voice called behind him. "Give them back!" Aemond let out a sound of nervous energy that could be mistaken for a laugh. With a tight grip on the invisibility cloak in one hand and clutching Ariel's wand in the other, Aemond jumped over an overturned barrel. His foot slipped on a patch of snow, but he managed to keep running. When Aemond peered over his shoulder, Ariel was keeping up with him. For a girl, she was pretty fast. Instead of keeping a straight path down the street, Aemond slipped into a side alley at the last moment, only to curse as he realized he'd ran straight into a dead end. Knowing it was over, Aemond turned to face his vexed witch. Ariel stood in the mouth of the alley, chest heaving, her cheeks apple red and as out of breath as himself. They'd ran from the shack of a house where the tongueless man had entered and quite the distance of back alleys and streets. "You have nowhere to run now, John?" Ariel punctuated his false name and took a greedy mouthful of air to catch her breath. She held out her hand. "Give it back." "I will give it back once we return home, Lily." Aemond dried his brow with his sleeve. It had been an opportunistic pilfering. They had been huddled underneath Ariel's magical cloak when the witch expressed her intentions to confront the suspect. Aemond had said no, they were not going to confront him. Ariel seemed to forget that she was a lady and he, despite being a dragon-riding prince, was still a couple of moons away from his 15th name day. Neither were particularly intimidating at a glance, with neither guard nor a dragon at hand. It'd sooner go badly. Though with her magic, he wasn't as worried for her well-being as he was for her reputation if things went wrong. But would she listen? Of course not. She tried to slip away without him, but Aemond had expected it. The magical cloak came off as he pulled her back, though she'd been about to twist free anyway, when he'd felt the outline of the wand. Aemond lifted a stick out of her pocket, which had certainly gotten her attention in a way little had before. It hadn't been a well-thought-out plan, so he'd simply ran. At some point her angry shouts had become exasperated, and then competitive, and here they were. "Pardon? At home? No, I will have them now, thank you very much. Those are mine." "I will gladly return your belongings," he offered generously while twirling her wand. "Granted you promise not to try to talk to filthy murderers again, and join me reporting our findings at the castle, and allow them to handle it from here." "But that's not fair," Ariel complained. "I disagree. It is actually quite fair. You want me to leave the task to the City Watch? I want to talk to him myself, to know why." "You want to speak to a man without a tongue?" Aemond asked, disbelieving. "I'm sorry, my dear, but I'm afraid it will prove a disappointing endeavor." "I could make him write down his confession." It took a heroic effort of will to stop himself from rolling his eyes. "Because that fine gentleman seemed a sort educated in the art of literature," Aemond said sarcastically. "Chances are he could neither talk nor write. So unless you have some spell that can drag knowledge directly from the man's head, you're out of luck. He will never tell you why. If he can't confess, then what can the City Watch hope to achieve?" "Their duty. The house can be searched thoroughly, the neighbors can be questioned, and it looked like there may be more than one person living there. It needs to be that way. They can do more than you." "Can they?" Ariel challenged, taking a step closer. "I can achieve a lot with my magic." Not without this," Aemond smirked, holding up her wand. The stick was about the same length as his knife, though noticeably lighter. "I was sure you'd try to spell me to a halt sooner, but I was stopped by the road's end and not my pursuer. can you do nothing without this piece of wood? Ariel bristled. I can do magic without it. I didn't have my wand tonight Vega tried burning us. Ariel took another step. That was true. However, you prefer the wand, or you wouldn't have bothered. You take it along wherever you go. It tickles my hand too. When he'd asked about it in the past, Ariel claimed it was to gain spell control, though she seemed very reliant on it. Ament hadn't seen her do magics without the wand since Vega's fire. Was that because being unburned was in her blood, the same as her dragon speech? Because she didn't need magic to make her voice make sounds no normal man could replicate? Ament had expected Ariel to stand there with her hand outstretched and wait him out, but no. She tackled him. Startled, he nearly didn't react in time. Though she managed to pull her cloak free, Ament held a stick above his head. Ariel jumped after it, but Ament turned, keeping it out of reach. They were acting like uncultured children, and somehow that made it all the funnier. There was no one of importance to pass judgment, so they could behave as undignified as they pleased. Ament laughed as Ariel leaped after her wand, unable to catch it when he turned away at the last moment. She tried to look annoyed, but her green eyes were too expressive, unguarded and free. She was having fun with this too. Ariel used his shoulder to push off from and gain more height, but without success. Ament kept his arm aloft, the wooden stick warm in his hand. A tingle ran from his fingers down his arm. The ghosting throb across his skin made the hairs on his arm stand on end. Though it was not entirely pleasant, it did not hurt either. On her fifth failed attempt, Ariel changed strategy. What? She was trying to tickle him, but the layers of clothes were in the way, and the effect was more akin to being patted down. Ament burst out laughing anyway, as Ariel looked crestfallen that her plan failed. It became a little more confused when she made yet another attempt, but she didn't go directly for the wand. Instead, her fingers grasped the collar of his cloak and pulled him down. The last he saw was the smirk on her face before she kissed him. Oh? Ariel lingered, then coaxed his mouth to move with hers, before Ament took over, maneuvering them into his rhythm. Her lips were soft, but the way she kissed him then was firmly full of promises and possibilities. Especially once her mouth opened, her tongue coming out to play and... Oh! Ament was sent reeling. This was better than the brief pecks or the memory of their drunken kiss in the corridor. With a clear mind, he was acutely aware of everything. Every press of her mouth, the taste of her tongue, how she tilted her head in response to him. Yet simultaneously, if a dragon started burning the street down, Ament wasn't positive he'd catch it. His mind had turned to fluffy clouds, occupied with her scent, soft lips, and his biggest concern was how to coax that sound out of her again, with little room for anything else. That is likely why Ament didn't think to protest when Ariel's fingers combed through his, prying her wand back. Ament was vaguely aware the kiss had been a tactic to get her stuff back, but he honestly didn't mind. He could feel her smile against his mouth, victorious that her sly little trick worked, but it only made him want to laugh too. Her breath ghosted over his skin, and her giggle mixed with his own chuckle. He kissed her cheek, then the tip of her nose. He felt fantastic, like he could do anything. And now Ament's hands were free to run through her thick black hair as he went in for a second round. She could have her stuff. Did she want his knife too? His sword? Ament would hand it over. At present, that seemed a perfectly fair exchange. The want on her lips and yearning on her tongue tasted sweeter than honey, making him come alive, and his thoughts whirling out of control. How the hell was he supposed to keep his hands off her for another year when she kept attacking him with her mouth? It was a sweet torture, but a torture all the same. Ariel untangled herself from their embrace, and cool air flowed across his mouth. She tilted her head as if listening, but Ament was occupied comparing her eyes to emeralds, and distracted by how tantalizing her swollen lips looked. Though when he leant in to kiss her again, her head turned up. It was then Ament heard it too. There was a strange sound on the air. Was that giggling? But it came from above. Don't throw it, Dina. They're kissing. Ew, why would you want to look at that? They're kissing! You want to see kissing? Go to the street of silk. Quiet, they can hear. It was then Eamon spotted the kids spying down on them. There were 3 of them, peeking out over the edge of the roof and into the alley, with snotty noses and red cheeks. A girl and 2 boys huddled in cloaks. They tied raggedy scarves snugly around their heads, except the smallest boy who'd wrapped it like a turban instead of a shawl. Not only can I hear you, but I can see you too, Eamon snapped. If you know what's good for you, you leave us be. They did not. 5 foot 3. The girl couldn't be older than 5 and spoke with an annoying lisp. You're in my alley. Go and kiss your wife in your own alley. Kiss? What was that supposed to mean? This is the king's city. Nothing here belongs to filthy little rooftop rats, he said. Irked the girl had the gall to lay claim to anything before her prince. Though he found he didn't mind that the little twat assumed him married. My family live here, the girl said, pointing at the roof she stood on. That make it my alley. My dad's real strong and scary too. If you don't go, he'll beat you up. What? Eamon struggled to understand her. He was about to put them in their place, but Harriel had a different way of handling them. It's good you're keeping your home in the King's City safe, Harriel said. Though mayhaps your children would be safer off the roof. It's cold and icy, and what if you fall? We're Knights of the Alley, and this is our watchtower, the 3rd one said. The girl shook her head. Grown-ups can't reach us here, she insisted. But our rocks can reach you. You think I can't reach you with a thrown rock, or that I'm incapable of climbing up there? Eamon asked. Try it! We are Knights of the Watchtower, and you shall not breach our defenses! The girl dared, while the boy with the turban headwear asked clueless, What does incapable mean? No one is trying anything, Harriel said decisively, linking her arm through Eamon's and pulling him along out of the alley. Victory! One of the kids shouted in the light. Outside the alley, there were people heading in different directions. But unlike earlier, this time people took notice. A passing man did a sharp double take, his eyes focused on Eamon's face, then down to his stained cloak and back. The children had surely remained clueless, but here it was different. His hood had fallen down during the chase, leaving his face and silver hair visible. Little beasts. Eamon glanced around, wondering what the shortest path would be back to the castle. If he wasn't mistaken, they weren't too far away from the Gold Road. Children. They're rude, always dirty, snotty and whining. How reassuring, Harriel drawled. That's exactly what I wanted to hear from the future father of my children. Ours won't be savages. Eamon's cheeks heated with a flush. Have you seen a babe, Eamon? They're hungry, greedy for attention, without manners and are only concerned for survival. I'd say they've got a fair bit in common with savages. What a reassuring thing to hear from the future mother of my children, Eamon said dryly. But before Harriel could respond, he dug down, catching her around the waist and picked her up. Harriel yelped as Eamon slung her unceremoniously over his shoulder. What are you doing? She wheezed between laughter. If you can be underhanded to get your way, then so can I, Eamon said, adjusting his hold to a more solid one and making Harriel clutch at his back. I'm bringing you home before you have any other bright ideas. Take me home? I'm not some wildling spearwife you can steal. I beg to differ. You just spoke of our savage children, did you not? Eamon said, struggling to keep her secure while walking at an even pace. This hold had appeared rather easy when he'd seen others do it. He found it wasn't quite as effortless in practice as in theory, though. Hanging off his shoulder, Harriel yanked at his hair in warning, even whilst her body shook with stifled laughter. Put me down! I can walk! You'll trip! Tug on my hair again and you'll have no one to blame but yourself if we trip. I'm too heavy for you! You're light as a feather, Eamon lied. She was slender but also a woman grown, with the height and curves that came with. most of which were hidden under weighty layers of clothes. And the jostling didn't help either. Aemond wouldn't let it show, though. Was Hariel insinuating he wasn't strong enough? Did she assume him weak? If so, he had no choice but to rectify the misconception. Aemond was certainly stronger than Daeron and his nephews. It'd be years until they were able to carry a grown woman like a sack of potatoes. The question remains whether you will return to the castle or venture off wherever your noisiness takes you. As long as we report it, I'll return to the castle with you, I swear! Come on, put me down! She whined. But Aemond wouldn't budge, at least not until... If you do, we could kiss again! A little after midday, the gate guards watched befuddled as their prince came strolling up from the city with his betrothed. Aemond enjoyed the confusion and the guards' questions regarding how they'd gotten out, but less so the remarks about how the Hand, the Queen and the King's Guard were looking for them. You can stop the search. As you see, we're present and well. Though I need you to bring me your commander promptly, Aemond ordered. The commander? You mean the Lord Commander of the King's Guard, Sir Harold? No, the commander of the City Watch. After a morning of not being a prince with Hariel, he was disappointed to see it end. Their clothes were back to normal, and Hariel had hidden away her magical cloak. Their errand was supposedly for duty and justice, but Aemond had ended up having a great time. The thrill of sneaking through the city had been exhilarating, and their return to the Red Keep promised little but scolding and nagging. It made Aemond wish they'd delayed a bit longer. Aemond had barely been able to report their findings from their excursion with the commander of the City Watch before Sir Criston arrived. Hariel was sent to her own rooms, while Aemond was marched directly to the Tower of the Hand for his grandsire to lecture him. I thought you had better wits than this, boy. I told you to leave her be, his grandsire said gravely. Aemond had been placed in the armchair by the hearth, and he preferred keeping his eyes on the crackling fire instead of being made to face this disappointment on his grandsire's strict face. He'd seen that expression many times directed towards Aegon, but not at himself. I am your prince, Aemond said quietly, thinking how he'd take the stench walking around the streets of King's Landing instead of suffering his grandsire's lectures any day. You can counsel me, but you cannot order me. I am your grandsire, Otto reminded him. I have every right to tell you when you're being a lackwit. You know what's at stake, and yet you do this. His grandsire had a way of speaking that was maddeningly calm, always composed, yet with an edge that cut sharper than a dagger. Mother disagrees. Your mother is beside herself with grief. With Aegon at death's door, she can't complete her normal duties, far less give sound counsel. She wants for nothing to change, and Aegon to be whole again, but it's already too late for that. Do you have any idea what you're risking, Aemond? Your safety, the lives of your family, and the stability of the kingdom is more important than your desires. We were looking out for the family, Aemond snapped, clutching the armrest tightly. We were in the city and learned more about Fang's killer in an hour than the City Watch has been able to provide in a week. It was a dog, boy. Whoever killed it is of no consequence. You do not care that someone is using the King's castle as their personal torture chamber, damaging our alliances and working against the King's wishes. Otto laughed. If this was about the King's justice or your princely duty, you'd have let a knight of the King's Guard go into the city instead, or allowed Daeron to take your place and kept your distance, as you agreed to. I never agreed, Aemond reminded him harshly. You presume too much, grandsire. His grandfather blinked. Briefly, he almost seemed uncertain, though it was gone in an instant. Would you give up the crown for the girl? Aemond's hands fisted, his gaze falling away from his grandsire and back to the fireplace. Yes! He had a mind to shout in spite, but somehow his lips remained pressed together. It wasn't true. Or was it? No. But then why was he arguing? No, The proper question was, why was he being forced to choose at all? A king could do as he pleased. If I am king, no one would be able to object who my queen was, Aemon said stubbornly, the nagging uncertainty making it hard to sound unaffected. A king had no superior and no equal, and who was the hand to speak to his king like this? It was because he didn't see Aemon as a king to begin with. He was but the latest option. Don't be childish, lad. They can object and they will, and then it'll be your duty to quiet them. But why should you take the risk when it's a situation we can avoid altogether? Do we not have enough to contend with without you adding additional grievances to the pile? You are nearly a man grown. How can you still be this blind? Your mother didn't give me this sort of trouble. Aemon sneered. How so? Did you order her to marry another lord, but then changed your mind after they were betrothed because the king became available? Your mother knew what was expected of her and did her duty. Steely disappointment dripped from his words. Daeron is younger than you, but he knows his place and is performing his duty too. You are the only one who is skirting his responsibilities. I am not, Aemon stated, his voice growing as cold and impersonal as his grandsire's. I am thinking of family. Unlike you, I am not scheming my brother's death. Even if your brother lives, his claim will be diminished by his crippling. Lacking limbs doesn't change his birth order as eldest prince, Aemon pointed out. I'd still be named a usurper for pushing my claim ahead of his, the same as King Maegor was. This is not aching to that situation. This is birthright and ability, and we require both. What lords would support a cripple like your brother when opposed by the likes of Daemon, the rogue prince who's grown his legend on bloodshed alone? What if Aegon survives crippled and lives to have a true-born son? Aemon snapped. Would that son not be as much of a threat to my son later down the line as Rhaenyra's are to my life at present? His grandfather took a deep breath, struggling for composure. We know better now than to repeat the mistakes that were forced on us in the past, but first we must make sure that we reach that future alive. If you care about keeping your head on your shoulders, you must do this. If Rhaenyra becomes queen, she will have you and your brothers killed to secure her claim. Which is why it'd be beneficial to have Vhagar, Norbert and magic on our side, wouldn't you agree? Aemon said tightly. His grandfather was not moved by the argument. I know you care for Lady Herial, but you need to sort out your priorities. Daeron will take well care of her. The boy is courteous and clever. She'll have nothing to worry about for the rest of her life. My concerns are for your life, however. I am trying to keep you alive, to keep your mother and siblings safe. And you are working against me. You are the one working against me. If you believe gambling with Herial and Hagrid's loyalties will be less risk, then you are working under some grave misconceptions, grandsire. They have Vhagar, and you have seen the bare minimum of what their magic can do. Herial won't forgive being played like a fool either. She became enraged with me in Winterfell over a slight I merely informed her about but did not do. She'd never forgive me this. And... Aemon dragged a hand through his hair, because one thing was having to give Herial up. That alone would not be easy, but he knew it would make his path to kingship less challenging, and becoming king remained a tantalizing dream. To sit the Iron Throne and rule the Seven Kingdoms as Aegon the Conqueror had, or how Vermithor's first rider King Jaehaerys did. More than once of late he had fantasized about being announced as King Aemond the Unburnt, and take a seat at the head of the throne room whilst the lords of Westeros bent their knee. To see his nephews, sisters, brothers, Valarians, Hightowers and the rest bend the knee. Then his family and the court would answer to him, and he wouldn't let them down. He'd herald in a golden age of dragons and magic to Westeros, and make the kingdom greater than it had ever been. His mother and sister would be proud of his achievements, and he'd soak in his brother's envy as Aemon proved he'd always been the best suited to be king. That Heriel would be so impressed with his grace as a king, she'd never look at another man again. So many issues would have been solved if Aemon had just been the firstborn. But he wasn't, and it wasn't that easy of an exchange. To give up Heriel did not necessarily mean he'd get everything he wanted. Aemon wouldn't simply be forced to marry a stranger. He'd also have to mistreat Heriel, but later endure his little brother marrying her while pretending that didn't make his stomach churtle. I don't want to marry Lady Elene. She's a child who Daeron picked for himself, but now I have to take his forsaken option? And he's supposed to marry? It's not fair. Aemon imagined his brother showing Heriel around Old Town, similar to how he and Heriel had walked around King's Landing that day. It made him ill. At the same time, he knew Daeron wouldn't mistreat her. His little brother wouldn't love her, but he'd treat her with respect. So how come did it not make the thought any less revolting? We play an ugly game, boy. None of this is fair, but the king has forced our hand. The king? Aemon asked. The only one forcing my hand is usually you. Because our situation doesn't allow us to err. This is what the king's stubbornness has wrought. We must stack the odds in our favor. And even you can't think that putting the realm and our lives on our crippled shoulders is a wise alternative. I've always acted in the interests of our family, and we cannot predict whether His Grace will have yet another switch of priorities that will leave our previous plans moot. We need contingency plans. Perchance Aegon will survive his recovery. Perhaps he'll have a son. But if he does not, and you find yourself wed and politically weakened, what then? What switch of priorities? Aemon had lost the trail of the conversation. My king father isn't hard to predict. I've rarely seen him change his mind on anything. That wasn't always the case. The king was not always what you've come to know him as today. For decades his pursuit of a son remained unwavering, all the way until Aegon was born. It was only until the king had the boy in hand that he thought to inform me he had changed his mind. Otto's voice was barely a whisper, a shadow over his eyes. That he'd stick with Rhaenyra as heir after all, regardless of how folly it was. You didn't predict that? He worships the ground Rhaenyra stands on. She could bet the whole garrison in the throne room before our king father, and he still refused to admit her sons are bastards. And you thought he wouldn't stick with Rhaenyra? He never entertained that notion until I talked him into making her heir. A mistake on my end. But how was I to know then? For his first decade as king, Rhaenyra was never His Grace's ideal heir, and he made no secret of his desire for a son to succeed him. Rhaenyra was only supposed to be the last solution during an unstable time where the king was unmarried, without a proper heir, and Daemon was exiled. The king needed to remarry to secure his succession, but when he did, it was only to change his mind after the fact. By then my daughter was wed and her mother maid, my grandson's life's in peril, and there was no turning back. What choice were we left with? Everyone must do their part so we may prevail. Heriel would make a fine queen. Her magic will strengthen the bloodline. Our children will be powerful dragonlords who anyone would be hard-pressed to challenge. Even other dragonlords. And she's better than some Stormlander girl who can't fucking read. Heriel is literate in 3 different tongues. Lady Heriel's accomplishments don't matter when she is a foreign witch, with no Westerosi ancestry nor royal blood to make up for it. She talks to dragons and can walk through fire. What is more Valyrian than that? It's her non-royal parentage that's an issue, not the quantity of Valyrian blood, his grandfather dismissed. There are whores in Lys who can boast more royal blood, half of them likely sired by Daemon. Anyone who tries to make Lady Heriel queen will ruin their political support. The people have not forgotten Queen Tiana of the Towers any less than they've forgotten Maegor. The people would not see past the title of witch. they did for Queen Visenya. Because she burned half the continent during the conquest. Lords learned early that arguing against her meant suffering the same fate. I didn't think I'd need to urge you not to follow such tyrannical examples to gain your queen's favor. Do you want her to be loved or feared? Do you want to be loved or feared? Even then, unlike Queen Rhaenys, Visenya was never loved. At best she was acknowledged as a necessary evil. Even her brother husband couldn't stand the witch. He sighed. It was a calculated risk to allow Lady Harriel to marry a second son of the king to begin with. But at the time we expected Aegon would be able to do his duty. Your betrothal was a compromise we settled on, because he's a dragon rider who made you an unburnt, and the match became easily defensible after Rubius claimed Vhagar's loyalty. But not as queen. Rising her to such a station alone can spark discord amongst those who'd otherwise be given assured loyalties. You do not mean to tell me that Harriel is an unsuited match? You can't be that deluded. Aegon's crippling means we've lost Sunfire. Helena is Rhaenyra's hostage, and that leaves me and Daeron alone to stand against all the dragon power of Dragonstone. We wouldn't stand a chance. Harriel has Norbert and Hagrid has Vhagar. Harriel's better off wed to me than Luke, is she not? His grandfather's nostrils flared with impatience. Of course, boy, but that's a military advantage, not a political one. Which you know. If you love her, do her and yourself this kindness and leave this stubborn naivete behind. The situation has changed, and Daeron is better placed for the alliance. He can bring in the firepower with this marriage while yours must bring as much validity as possible. You need it more than Aegon did, as you, like me, are a second son. If Aegon died and the Baratheons weren't an issue, I'd have a mind to betroth you to Baela. Aemon's blood went cold, and he couldn't have hidden his revulsion even if he had attempted it. Him? Married to Baela? That little beast? If forced into such a union, they'd end up murdering each other. His grandfather must have noticed his reaction, but kept on preaching as if he hadn't. Don't expect things to end harmoniously simply out of wishful thinking. We must lead by example too. Your father is a kind man who means well, but his stubbornness in this regard will tear Westeros apart unless a rightful king can unite the realm. Don't be like him, or the choices made in the flush of youth will be the end of you. His grandsire talked as if he had great concern for Aemon's well-being and security in mind, but the manner it had come about left a bad taste in his mouth. What of Aegon? Was one grandson as good as the next? And which one mattered was based on which grandchild held the best claim? Was that why Aegon had never made an effort? Why would he need to try when he'd have this sort of support regardless if he'd spent years striving to uphold his duty the way Aemond had? When he'd gained just as much and more simply because he existed? And now that Aegon wasn't the favoured heir anymore, his support dwindled as easily as if it had been gained. It was situational and not earned. That might be my fate too, Aemond thought, and the reminder settled like spoiled milk trickling down his throat. If I fail as an ideal heir by making too big a blunder, he'll go to Daeron next and not look back. If I can't be of use to the cause, I might as well not be his grandson. He'd hand me over to a bastard as easily as he'd let Helena go, and bypass Aemond as quickly as he had to Aegon. The Hand and the King had that in common. They displayed it differently, but this was not the first time Aemond realized he and his siblings were as interchangeable to Otto Hightower as they were to their king father. His mother cared for him, Aemond knew. She remained the queen first and foremost, but she didn't dismiss them unless courtly politics kept her away, which admittedly was the case on most days, though Aemond had seen for himself how deeply she loved Aegon. She knew what he was just as Aemond did, yet she dropped everything for him. Aemond had barely seen his mother since the wedding, and when he did, she looked like a ragged shadow of her normal self. And it was all for Aegon of all people. Maybe it was natural. They said the first child was the favoured child, and his mother was as doting on her firstborn as his father was of his. Their mother also cherished Helena as her only daughter, and had a connection with Deron, who everyone said was a lot like their mother, and it didn't hurt he was squiring in Old Town with their mother's kin, which left him last. Eamon didn't like to think of who he was most often compared to. Some said he looked like Damon, and that was only because of how similar their names were, and Heriel had more than once compared him to Rhaenyra, the two people his mother happened to hate most in the world. Though even if he wasn't his mother's favourite son, Eamon knew that at least he was Helena's favourite brother. Except, maybe not anymore. Before she left for Dragonstone, Eamon didn't let his temper get the better of him. He couldn't fathom why she wasn't furious about her fate. Why she so easily went about packing up her belongings, let herself be played by Rhaenyra. They'd parted on bad terms, so mayhaps Daedon was her new favourite now. Heriel would never do that, Eamon thought to himself, even his old doubts returned with a vengeance. No, that was silly. She'd agreed to marry him specifically, not Daedon, Luke, or Cregan fucking Stark. Would she kiss him like she had that day if she didn't want him? It had felt real. Eamon tried to convince himself of it, but couldn't quite forget how long it took before she noticed him as a suitor, or how she'd pushed their marriage back. Now it was half a year later than their previous agreement. She'd had her reasons for the delay though, right? Eamon forced himself to stop thinking of it. What did it matter? As long as he proved himself, they'd have no reason to turn on him. And at the end of the day, Eamon could always be sure of Vermithor. His dragon was Aemon's most trusted, bonded beyond blood and duty. The dragon had chosen him, and would take no other whilst Aemond yet lived. They were tied through fire and blood, so deeply that at times Vermithor felt like a part of him. Sometimes he dreamt he was a dragon, and it made Aemond wonder whether Vermithor ever dreamt he was a man. Aemond stared intently into the fire, imagining scenes in their depths. He stared for so long his vision blurred. It was almost as if he could see the spiky head of his dragon Vermithor. The fires flickered and changed, but Aemond glimpsed Vermithor melt in and out of focus. He rose his head and spewed fire, which clashed against the raging flames of an enemy dragon. He imagined them taking flight and lifting higher and higher, circling each other as fire soared, a deadly dance as claws and teeth tore into each other. One enemy fell only for a second to take its place. He imagined more joining, surrounding the bronze fury. They collided, sparks fizzled in the fireplace, and then there was only fire. I don't agree. Because Aemond could say naught else. His grandfather had his reasons, but they simply weren't good enough. Which point do you disagree with? His grandsire demanded. What can you argue here? That I don't agree. You've misread the situation before, grandsire. Aemond reminded him, standing up from the armchair, ready to take his leave. You're repeating that mistake now. Is this something you'd risk your life over, Aemond? He asked tightly. Would you? Aemond speculated, his stomach in knots and his heart weighed down like a stone. He kept his face passive as he told his grandsire. As long as Aegon yet lives, this is moot. What would you think best if your brother was to die? His grandfather was like a hound on a trail which Aemond couldn't shake off. Absolutely relentless. If I was the king's eldest son, my situation would be different, Aemond acknowledged. And so would my responsibilities, but it's simply not the case. Why are you planning for hypotheticals instead of the actual situation at hand? Though if it was, would you agree to my counsel then? Would you perform your duty to protect the family and act as a king must? I would do my duty if it was my duty, but it is not. That was not what his grandsire wanted to hear, and he could see the frustration clearly on his face now. You are willing to risk everything for a comely face. Your approach risks all of our heads. And your approach will see me torn apart by dragons, Aemond snapped. You don't lack for nerve preaching of risks with me. Of everyone involved, you are not the Dragon Rider, nor will you ever be on the front lines. You fight your battles through politics, through laws, books and schemes at a safe distance. But you do not know war and fire. You don't get your hands dirty as you leave that to us. Whilst our opposition knows only war and victory through force, but little of politics. It shouldn't come to that, Otto argued. I am trying to clear a path for your ascension to the throne. A peaceful transition of power that will avoid war altogether, boy. If you do as you're told, I will gladly give you everything you've ever dreamed of. Aemon swallowed, and for a splendid moment the daydream of the Iron Throne, the power in the crown was so vivid it was unbearable. He could almost feel the firm weight of black fire between his fingers. It was his dream, yet the closer it got, the more it was turning into a nightmare. Aemon would have to agree with his grandsire about one matter. None of this was fair, and they played an ugly game. How come you keep trying to get the law on our side? To stack up contingency schemes that give validity? By law, Aegon should always have been the heir. But laws mean nothing when the opposition won't acknowledge it. If our opposition does not fear us, there will be war, regardless of who has the most support. The reality of our situation is that we need Herial. Clever schemes, beneficial alliances and politics won't keep the sword like Daemon in check if there's but a couple of dragons in his path to the throne. He may defer to my king father, but he won't do so for me. Not Aegon, Daeron nor Rhaenyra. Though with Aegon as king, at least he'd hesitate as his daughter would be queen. But even that's a stretch. We need power. We need to be a valid threat. Not just against Rhaenyra and Daemon, but for the lords of Westeros to feel like their cause has a fighting chance. What lord would bet on 2 dragons when the opposition has more than 3 times as many? Aemon asked of the Hand. Without Herial, I would have died in Dragonfire alongside Sir Laenor. With Aegon's crippling too, you would have no grandson except Daeron and his toddler dragon to fight for your cause. So do not pretend your schemes to switch the betrothal agreements doesn't come with significant risk. If all goes well, then yes, I agree that your plan has merits. But why would it go to plan when nothing up to now has? If it goes wrong, we'll lose everything. We're outnumbered 7 Dragon Riders to our 2. Don't chase Norbert and Vhagar into their waiting arms by insulting Herial, and so make it 9 against 2. I might as well let you cut off my head off as we speak, grandsire. Then at least I'd face my aunt knowing Vermithor would be spared.